Today we look at the venerable Tamiya model kit for the Japanese Chai-Ha medium tank. This kit was originally cut in 1975, so it's nearly 50 years old. Like most tank kits, the build begins with the road wheels, sprockets, and idlers. And here we see the tooling is showing its age, with some solid mold lines that need to be sanded away before we can begin assembly. Next up is the underdeck suspension bits. I laid them out for each side, and this is how they look once they're glued in place. The front lower hull slides into place with just a slight push on the sidewall so that it can get in where it needs to go. And once you get it there, you just need a little bit of glue to set it in place. There are some spots that need putty because of poor fit and alignment, but it's fairly easy to do without much loss in detail. Before adding the lower rear hull, we have to add the toe clevises. These are a bit fiddly, but they snap into place. And once they're glued to the hull, they're free to move about. You could glue them in place, but you might want to wait until you have the tank set on its diorama base to see what the correct position should be based on the orientation of the vehicle on the diorama. Before gluing this rear hull place in place, I took the opportunity to prime the interior light gray. All the lower road wheels, sprockets, and idlers got primed gray as well. Then there are these three little return wheels that need to be glued in place. They don't spin or turn. They merely hold the track in place on the top side return. And while we're at it, let's put the rest of the wheels in place just to see how it all looks. This also gives us an opportunity to see if we got the number of links correct on our link and link track. See the video here. And indeed, we do have them in the proper length. I really like the way those tracks look, so much better than those vinyl rubber bands supplied in the kit. Time to work on the upper hull. Construction begins with the rear of the tank and the engine covers and exhaust/mufflers. I left all the pioneering tools off and the two toe chains off as well. That way I could get the camouflage painted and then I'll add them after the painting. The heat shields are best glued from the underside. There's a rear engine hatch and a toolbox that can go on the rear deck at this time. There are 3 pieces for each muffler, and they do have a different part depending on what side they fit into, so I suggest building one side completely, then moving to the other side. The engine cover hatches are molded into a folded down flat position, and they slot into place with the false hinges acting as a location device. The driver's hatch can be glued in the opened or closed positions. Since I'm not using the driver figure that came with the kit, nor do I have a replacement figure for that driver, I'm just going to glue it closed. Moving from the back of the tank to the front of the tank, there is the front armor plate to place. And again, the biggest struggle is alignment. Once again, plastic putty is our friend here to close up any of these gaps. I like using Vallejo plastic putty as you can just apply it roughly, and after it sets up for a few minutes, you come back in and wipe off the excess with a dampened cotton swab, and most of the time the acrylic putty fills just the gap and there's no sanding required. The machine gun is not glued in place, so it's just a little tricky, but once you figure out the trick, the second unit in the turret goes much easier. The trick here is to dry fit the retainer clip in place and check how the barrel looks on the top side. Then come back with some extra thin cement and just let it wick from the back side and fix the retainer in place. And now you have a machine gun that will actually move a little bit. The last major interior piece is the engine radiator. This needs to be pre-painted a khaki color, and it has really good location markers for where to glue it in place. Here you can see how it looks in place and how it blocks the view to the interior of the rear tank. And this is a little important because the kit doesn't have any engine buildup or much of any interior details at all. The last bit of armor for the top hull is a side plate. It fits rather well on the same side of the hull where the turret sits. It's just a flat rectangular piece and it slides right into place. A little bit of glue, all set. The 57mm main gun and mandolet come in several pieces. They need to be dry fitted or cemented together. Again, the instructions are clear about what parts get glued and what parts are not. And if you do this following the instructions, it'll allow for changes of elevation of the main gun once it's assembled to the turret. In real life, this tank was designed as an infantry support platform, not a go head-to-head with other main battle tanks. So it has a secondary heavy machine gun mounted in the rear of the turret. And while the design of the retainer is just slightly different than that from the main hull, cementing it in place is the same process. Here we have all the turret bits sub-assembled. That way I can still get to the interior colors and not have these in the way. Dry fitting the top and bottom holes together revealed a huge gap. I guess you really can't see it unless you tip the vehicle upside down, but I don't like the idea of it not looking like a finished hull. So I took some plasticard out of my supplies and just cut some bits off to fit in the openings. There are slightly different shapes from side to side, so it takes a little bit of time to get them to fit flush and not interfere with the gluing of the two halves together. But I think it's worth it. And while they aren't a perfect fit, they cover about 99.9% of the gaps, and that just makes me so much happier that I know there isn't this ugly, huge gap under the tracks. So before gluing the two halves, the upper hull and the lower hull together, I did give them an overall primer coat of gray, and then I followed that up with a aged white color for the interior of the tank. After the paint was dry, the two hulls were cemented together and given an overnight to fully cure. Then everything was given a light gray primer coat, and I used wadded up paper towel to keep the primer out of the pre-painted interior bits. I purposely have not added the iconic radio antenna to the turret. I was afraid I would snap it with all the painting and weathering to come, so I planned to attach it after most of that is complete. With that being said, I did manage to break it into 4 parts after cutting it from the sprue. This happened when it fell from my desk and I either stepped on it or rolled over it with my chair, so be aware that this part may cause some heartache. Looking over the instruction sheet, I decided I would go for the first design, which is an early war scheme used mostly in mainland campaigns, but also saw some action when the Imperial Japanese Army moved south through the Singapore Islands. What this means for me is that I need this iconic yellow camouflage stripe to run the 4 corners of the tank. And since yellow is a notoriously hard color to paint over darker colors, I opted to paint it now. Using the drawings provided in the instructions as a rough guide, I laid down some yellow paint through an airbrush, freehand, where I thought the stripes should be. Roughly, again, breaking the tank into 4 quarters. So that's as far as we got this week. Next week, I'm planning on getting the rest of the camo pattern laid down, adding the few decals that come with the kit, work on weathering and adding the tracks, and hopefully getting that radio antenna in place without it looking like 4 parts glued together. Anyhow, folks, thanks for watching my video, and if you liked it, please consider a like and subscribe.